Here we are, Judgment. I mean, two left. This is it. We're coming down to the wire. So Judgment was another card that I kind of struggled with when I was learning. I just felt like it's just a weird concept to me, and I guess it's not that weird because I grew up with it. But at the time I was learning, I was sort of trying to disconnect from all of that Catholicism that had messed with me so much. And this is sort of the only Trump that is specifically a Christian idea. It's not exclusively, but it is specifically a Christian idea, and it was sort of like I resisted that as a young reader, sort of trying to figure out my own path, and I resisted the card, and I didn't really get it, and I didn't really want to. Throughout the series, I've talked about how some of the ideas in the tarot have been Christianized by sort of white European ideals, but they were things like the Fortuna, the Fool, the Madman, empresses and emperors, these concepts, hermits, existed before Christianity and just sort of were sucked into the vacuum. Is that appropriate? But the Last Judgment, which is sort of this Christian cosmological sorting hat of good or bad, is really specifically from the tradition of Christianity as I understand it. Now, Christians weren't the only communities or groups to have concepts like this. You can think about the Egyptian idea of Ma'at, weighing your heart against a feather. And actually the World Spirit Tarot, which is one of my workhorses, depicts judgment that way. So, like I said earlier, it's not exclusively a Christian idea, but it's a very specifically Christian idea. And again, that just made me go meh when I saw it in readings. So what are we dealing with? Like, if we take this concept that I've been talking about through the last bunch of videos, what do we do if we're looking at judgment? Well, really what we're looking at is this myth, this metaphor of being judged. And notice that I said being judged, not judging or judgment. Because if you take the story that is being depicted on the card, you take this myth of the Last Judgment, it is an act of being judged. We are the passive ones in the situation. We are not the ones with power. We are being judged by some force greater than our own. So that means we are, our querent, are the ones receiving judgment in some way. Generally, it could be in some cases that we are the judger, but I think justice really has more of that quality of being the judge and jury rather than judgment, which is sort of this more passive idea of being judged. So this card can represent any time where we're just being judged. This might suggest job interviews or, employee evaluations, submitting artwork or writing to an editor or gallery, submitting a portfolio for approval, submitting a manuscript. Anytime where we're sort of submitting ourselves to, or some gatekeeper is a word I've used a lot through the series, is judging us, then we can see that in the judgment card. And so, for artists, creators, applicants for jobs, it's a neutral idea. It's not a judgment in a positive or negative way. It's just that we are submitting ourselves to the process of being judged. And any time that happens, anytime someone else is in the power position of judging us, then that can show up in this card. Really, it's about any time we're being scrutinized. And so with a lot of coins cards, for example, it could suggest something, as banal as an IRS audit. Or with wands or cups, it could suggest sort of submitting ourselves to the wild, wild west of a dating app. You know what I mean? We are basically putting ourselves in the position of being judged by others. Auditions, again, job interviews, newspaper interviews, any sort of situation where someone may be in a position to proclaim judgment on us, for better or worse. There's that in the card. Now, I did mention that this card is principally a card of being judged, but if it's surrounded by dominant cards, emperors, empresses, the queens and kings, for example, it might flip the script and mean that in this case the querent or you are the judger and not the judgy. And that can happen. Again, as we have said throughout, it is context, 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 day in and day out, day and night, all about context. So you can see the opposite of what I said as much as you see exactly what I said in the card, if you're looking for it, if it's there, if the context says it, and certainly the more information you have in the question, the more information you have from the querent, or that you yourself have about your own situation, the more you'll know. Still, ultimately though, I feel like the religious traditions that this card comes from, and the way it's depicted, sort of suggests a passive rather than an active role. And again, as I've said many times throughout this, there are times where we are not in the control seat. We are not the one with the agency, and sometimes it's helpful to know that. It might be a reminder that we can't control what other people think of us, something I have to remind myself every time I post a video on YouTube. A more common association for this card is that it simply represents awakenings, which is, though popular, not a bad idea. In fact, there have been many, many readings that I've done over the years where this card suggests exactly that. But again, I think the idea in a lot of more esoteric-minded books is that it's sort of great awakening. It is a spiritual awakening. It is a, sort of Saul on the road to Damascus kind of moment. I think I got the right character there. But really, it can just be any kind of waking up, getting up in the morning, a wake-up call from a hotel, or a wake-up call in life where you're like, you got to get your shit together. Things like that are a little more daily, a little more banal. Just waking up. Or just being alert, you know what I mean? Being alert to the world around you. One of the things that I've talked about in terms of intuition is that intuition is often simply our alertness to the patterns of things that are happening around us. So if we're, like I said in the book, if we're from the city and we sort of know the sounds of traffic, we know when it's safe for us to cross the street, even if we're not looking at the signage. Where if we grew up on a farm, we might know the sound of a predator, in the distance who might come to prey on the animals. So like we have these intuitions because we're alert to the world around us in specific ways. And so this card can suggest that too, just being alert to something. Could be a warning, could just be sort of, paying attention, being a defensive driver, for example, whatever the case is, but just being alert to the world, awake to the world, rather than sort of a zombie. Well, more on zombies presently. If you were to pair it with the Empress or the Queens, it might suggest some kind of awakening to your power. The way that the Empress, for example, who didn't come into the role necessarily expecting to do it as the head of state, awakens to her power in that case. If it were surrounded by wands cards, it might suggest puberty or sexual awakening of some kind. And surrounded by cups, it might suggest that you're starting to feel some sort of way about somebody. Now again, that some sort of way, that non-specific thing, will be indicated by the other cards and by the situation and the question, etc. And even with swords, it might be awakening to a new way of thinking and a sort of realization or even a perception shift, which I think is something that if we are awake, if we are alert, we will experience a lot in life. And that's a good thing. It's how we learn and grow. And hopefully a lot of you have had perception shifts, and based on the comments, I think some folks have had perception shifts of cards based on these, and that's kind of a judgment moment too. I think there's an interesting tension, an interesting dance that happens if this card is paired with the High Priestess, because as I talked about in that video, the High Priestess has a lot to do with sort of withholding things, and the awakening of judgment is the opposite of that. It's the revelation of things. And so, there's this push and pull there. Does judgment sort of pull back the High Priestess's curtain, for example? Or does the High Priestess block awakening? The positioning of the cards could be really interesting. Other cards certainly in the reading, as I keep saying. But the tension between those two cards is really interesting. There's sort of a tug-of-war between hiding and revealing that I think is very common in modern life in a lot of ways for a lot of folks. Especially in a world of like social media, where we're sort of like dancing between what of our private lives is available for public consumption and what people have a right to expect from us or for us to reveal to them, etc. So really interesting stuff from that point of view. That combo could be really powerful and really fascinating and just really exciting in a reading. The moon and judgment might suggest insomnia for some reason. That sort of being awake at night combination. I think, as someone who has had a fair amount of insomnia lately, it makes sense. Or with a lot of high numbered cards, 10s, 9s, and 10s, it might suggest exhaustion, as those cards kind of often do themselves. So awakening with the 9s and 10s, judgment with the 9s and 10s might suggest like, you just need rest, you just need sleep. Being wired, being overtired, that sort of feeling of being too tired to sleep, you could find that there too. I mean, look, if you want to get more creative than that, and if you're reading about different kinds of things, if you're looking for a card that suggests a zombie apocalypse, this is your card. I mean, there's literally people rising from the dead. So if you want to know something about the zombie apocalypse or whether your neighbor is a hot vampire, then, this is a good card that could indicate that.
Because there are a lot of bad people out there, Charlie.
This is a loud card, so paired with like party cards, depending on what system you use, but like the 4 of Wands in the Rider-Waite-Smith, for example, or the 9 or 10 of Wands, 9 or 10 of Cups in the Rider-Waite-Smith. This could suggest noisy neighbors, or just being in a noisy environment, a noisy celebration of some kind. It's also unexpected, so it's a card that is sudden and fast. So if you're thinking about timing, it's a card that will suggest this happens suddenly, quickly, like pow, there it is. It's sort of like that feeling of like when you're dozing off and your body just sort of jolts you awake, which happened to me about 9 times last night. That awakening, that judgment feeling of like boom, your body just kind of goes like pow, boom, boom, pow, and you're awake. Know what I mean? Know what I'm getting at? But the suddenness, the quickness of it, the unexpectedness of it, is sort of what we're after. And then, also the feeling of kind of unknowingness and confusion after that happens, that sort of sustained moment, mere seconds, but it feels like it lasts a long time of, where am I? What am I doing? How did I get here? I remember waking up in a hotel room once, and just having had a dream that someone was breaking into my apartment at home, and I was in bed, and my window at home was right there. And I woke up, and I was not at home, and I had no idea where I was. It was that sort of panic of like, where am I? And it took me long minutes to realize, I was in a hotel, but that sort of like, whoa feeling. My heart rate was like, I could feel it all through my body. It was like that intense. Like, so you could get that feeling here. So those are your prompts, or your sort of inspiration to think about judgment in daily life. I think it's a pretty straightforward card once you strip away, again, the kind of religious connotations of it, or you take those and you bring them down to earth, which is the whole point of the series. So that's really it. Where do you see judgment in real life? Where do you see it in day to day? How do you work with it? As always, we have one more, not as always, we have one more card left, but as always, I hope this is interesting. I hope this is helpful. Be good. We'll talk soon. Take care.